Hello, my name is Jeremy Swist. Thank you for tuning into my presentation, Romanticized and to a Great Extent Utterly Wrong Images, the Impact of Cinematic Antiquity on Heavy Metal Music. So I'll start by discussing metal's reception of antiquity. There is currently, in the catalog of metal songs written since the 1970s, thousands of songs on a broad array of topics in antiquity, from history to mythology to literature to philosophy, with the majority of these songs focused on ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. There have been hundreds of bands worldwide that have written at least one song on these topics, but there are plenty of bands that have produced whole concept albums, and as well as a handful of bands like Ex Deo that are devoted exclusively to topics like ancient Roman history. And in the past 10 years, there's been a growing body of scholarship in both academic journal articles, book chapters, and whole edited volumes by classicists and Egyptologists and medievalists and others who have looked critically and tried to explain the phenomenon of the reception of antiquity in heavy metal by the likes of Osman Umarhan, Leira Olavarria, Elena Gonzalez Vacarizo, Christian Thuderslev, and myself. So let's look at what some of them have to say in order to explain why heavy metal sees such an appeal in various topics from the ancient world. Osman Umarhan in Selecta Classica says that metal's appropriation of Greek and Roman antiquity in terms of aggression, struggle for power, and masculinity speaks predominantly to a youth culture that uses the medium of metal as a platform for its general angst and feelings of alienation from contemporary society, and thereby seeks to mark its own place in society. Moreover, in the first edition of the journal Metal Music Studies, Christian Thuderslev argues that the Alexander figure, a very common and popular figure in heavy metal's classical reception, created by heavy metal narratives, has much in common with Achilles today as in antiquity, and they are popular paradigms and models for the idealized masculine figure of the heroic past. The bands are also attracted to the Alexander figure because of the special resonance that he has with community and unity. These themes claim the attention of all the bands in various ways and through powerful concepts such as universality and nationalism. In other words, Alexander not only is the ideal, powerful, masculine individual to emulate, but he's also a common cultural touchstone, as well as a national hero of various bands in Greece. Finally, the Spanish classicist Elena Gonzalez Vacarizo sums up the appeal of ancient Rome specifically to heavy metal bands in four dimensions here: masculinity, escapism, empowerment, and nationalism, all colored by a dimension of romanticism for an idealized past in rejection of the status quo. Finally, we should look a little further back at the genesis of metal studies scholarship in the early 90s by the founding mother of metal studies, Dina Weinstein. And you'll see that her explanation of what the core themes of heavy metal are requires a look at Greek mythology and religion in order to explain it. She says that the major themes of heavy metal fall into two clusters defined by a binary opposition: Dionysian and chaotic. Dionysian experience celebrates the vital forces of life through various forms of ecstasy. It is embodied in the unholy trinity of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The Dionysian is juxtaposed to a strong emotional involvement in all that challenges the order and hegemony of everyday life, that is, chaos. Monsters, the underworld, and hell that are grotesque and horrifying, disasters, mayhem, carnage, injustice, death, and rebellion. And though this was written in the early 90s, this idea of these two gods, essentially being the gods of heavy metal, has been maintained as the genre has continued to develop. The classicist Chris Fletcher has studied specifically bands in the Mediterranean, in the former limits of the Roman Empire and ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, who have used heavy metal not only to channel their masculine aggression and their feelings of rebellion, but also ways of tapping into their ancient heritage as a form of this rebellion. Looking at ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome as places where the masculine values of heavy metal are celebrated And also, this is where your authentic identity is, in an implicit rejection of the Christian or Islamic establishment in which these bands grew up. And we also see certainly hypermasculine figures in the pharaoh here or in Poseidon here, okay, and also notions of power and violence and chaos in all of these. Right? And Mediterranean metal was not the first to do this. Before Mediterranean metal really came to the fore, bands since the late 80s and early 90s in places like Scandinavia have looked at Viking history and Norse mythology for similar inspiration, where they find figures that are ideals of masculinity, rebellious figures, and also figures that to them represent their true pagan pre-Christian heritage in an implicit rejection of the Christianized status quo, as represented by this album cover here with the destruction of the Christian cross. But we also see here on this album cover on the left, we see this idealized masculine figure wearing a very unhistorically accurate Viking helmet with the horns. Okay, and that is definitely not what Vikings wore. However, this is a band from Sweden that very well may have known that this is not how Vikings would have looked. So what explains that? Was it pure ignorance, or was this deliberate? And there is evidence to suggest that this phenomenon is deliberate. If we look at the genesis of Viking metal itself with the Swedish band Bathory, so the lead person in the band Bathory was a man named Quorthon. And Bathory originally wrote, in the mid-80s, wrote songs that had more of the stock themes of rebellion and aggression and individualism in heavy metal, that is satanic and anti-Christian themes. But he saw that the transition to singing about his own national heritage and about Vikings and paganism also was a way of channeling those instincts. He said that that Satan in Hell soup type of soup was changed for proud and strong Nordsmen, shiny blades of broadswords, dragon ships, and a party till-you-puke type of living up there in the great halls. An image of my ancestors, my Swedish ancestors, and that era not too far from the romanticized and to a great extent utterly wrong image most people have of that period in time through countless Hollywood productions. In other words, Quorthon here saw in the Hollywood and pop culture version of Vikingdom an image that was more appealing to the core themes of heavy metal. And so he ran with those in writing his songs, despite knowing to the contrary that these were not historically accurate depictions. And indeed, we should acknowledge the debt that heavy metal has to popular culture and especially cinematic popular culture since the beginning. One of the first heavy metal bands is the British band Black Sabbath, which put out its first album in 1970, Black Sabbath, and the band took its name directly from the 1963 Boris Karloff horror film Black Sabbath, because the likes of Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Ozzy Osbourne were trying to create a genre of rock and roll that was essentially the musical equivalent of a horror film, exploring the darker themes that had not really been previously explored in rock and roll music up to that point. And that trend certainly continued into the 70s and into the 80s with Black Sabbath's countryman Angel Witch, who formed in 1978 and released their debut album, self-titled, in 1980. Okay? And you can see that a lot of their songs have to deal with themes of the occult, of witches, of dangerous women, as well as things like Atlantis. So they have several instances of appealing to themes of antiquity. But they also have a song called Gorgon, and let's talk about that. The song Gorgon by Angel Witch is essentially a heavy metal adaptation of the film The Gorgon, which came out in 1964 and stars Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee and Barbara Shelley. And the Gorgon is inspired, of course, by the Medusa myth. But the premise of the film is essentially that the spirit of one of Medusa's sisters, named Megara in this film, had survived into the modern day, where it took possession of a woman named Carla, who essentially turned people into stone during all the times that she was possessed by this spirit. And at the end of the film, she's essentially ambushed by her lover, Paul, who didn't realize that she was the Gorgon. And she was decapitated by Christopher Lee's character. Spoilers. And the Angel Witch song essentially retells, more or less, that film, especially the scene where she is decapitated by Christopher Lee. But we'll notice that in the film, that in the song, the band kind of reorients this view of the Gorgon as someone who is deliberately deceiving the male protagonist. Okay? A female that brings doom, don't let her deceive you. Right? And the idea that this is almost an allegory, this film, almost an allegory for a relationship in which the woman is deliberately feigning her love for you, and that the only way to get out of this relationship is through violent means. Okay? And so this theme of Medusa as the archetypal femme fatale becomes very popular in heavy metal from this point, perhaps best represented in the Anthrax song Medusa that came out a few years later. The next film I'll focus on also has to do with Medusa a bit more directly, and that's the film Clash of the Titans, which came out a year after Angel Witch's album in 1981. Okay, so this is one of the most popular retellings of the Perseus and Medusa myth, which also introduces Pegasus from the Bellerophon myth as Perseus's form of transportation both to and from Medusa's lair. I will focus on the concept album Dark Gorgon Rising by the Cypriot power metal band Astronomicon. And one thing I'd like to stress is that album artwork is essentially what helps really sell an album. This is the first thing that consumers of heavy metal encounter, and this is essentially the image that people associate with this music. And so in order to appeal to a familiar cultural touchstone, in 2013, Astronomicon represented Medusa as she was represented by Ray Harryhausen in Clash of the Titans on the left there, as this very Gorgon-like from the ancient world serpentine monster, okay, with green skin. And you can see that she is similarly represented on the album cover. However, we also see that she is far more sexualized than in Harryhausen's original, again, appealing to metal's themes of hypersexualization of both male heroes and feminine heroines and antagonists, such as Medusa. Okay? And we see this even more so in other receptions of Medusa in metal, such as that by the Argentine power metal band Axe Battler, who in their debut album represent Medusa also in a both serpentine and sexualized manner, to be contrasted with the hyper-masculine Perseus in the album cover, who looks very much like Conan the Barbarian or the members of the band Manowar as these sort of barbarian, hyper-masculine figures. However, despite using the Harryhausen Medusa in order to appeal to a wide audience, the lyrics of this album betray a very comprehensive reading of the primary sources for the Medusa myth, not only the literary sources, but also material culture. Okay? So in the title track, we see references to Medusa as a formerly beautiful maiden, okay, who was transformed into a Gorgon by Athena, okay, after she was raped by Poseidon. okay? And this account comes from Ovid, mainly. But the band also demonstrates that they read sources such as Hesiod and Pseudo-Apollodorus, describing the Gorgons with serpent scales, bronze hands, and golden wings. But also, we see evidence that the band is familiar with the famous vase by the Gorgon painter from the Archaic period, which shows Perseus running away from Medusa's sisters after he had decapitated Medusa here. Also, we saw from the album cover that Pegasus was introduced, much like he was in Clash of the Titans, and the song Bloodborne shows a familiarity with the ancient source Genesis of Pegasus as coming out of the decapitated neck of Medusa. But here, in addition to that happening, Perseus sees Pegasus as a convenient way of escaping from Medusa's sisters. So we have a very interesting combination of the film and the primary sources in this album. The next film I want to look at briefly is the film Quo Vadis, which, among other things, has one of the most famous and influential representations of the Emperor Nero. And I'll look at the song Nero by the Swiss thrash metal band Messiah, who in 1987 put out a song called Nero, which largely focused on Nero's deliberate setting fire to Rome and singing while Rome burns. And this song celebrates Nero, okay, as someone who embodies madness and embodies kind of antipathy to the status quo, that his singing out of key while Rome burns, as he does in the film, okay, corresponds to how heavy metal music uses sonic transgression as well as transgression in its subject matter. Okay? Also, as in the film, this song celebrates Nero, who, as not only kind of a nihilist who, in a poetic way, burns down Rome as part of his sort of poetic project, but he even blames the Christians for it at the same time, even though he takes credit for burning it. And we see in the dialogue to Quo Vadis from the 1950s that why this particular Nero appeals to a band like Messiah, because the Nero in that film also is represented as mad, but also is represented as ambitious to do something that is worth remembering, whether it is good or evil. Okay? And that transgression, if you will, is a work of art that will immortalize his fame. The last film I want to look at is 300. And this is a film that is certainly familiar for its representation and misrepresentation of the ancient Spartans and the ancient Persians, and its appeals to various fascist representations of these civilizations. And certainly classicists and others have been doing a lot of damage control as a result of this film, which came out in 2007. And that certainly includes its influence on heavy metal. Certainly in album artwork, where we see bands taking the comic book representations of the Spartans directly, as well as lyrics directly from the film. Okay? In fact, we can quantify this. Sparta in general is one of the most popular themes in heavy metal music's reception of the ancient world, and we can see the correlation between the number of songs on Sparta that came out and various events, such as the premiere of 300 in 2007, when the number of songs spiked. But we can also see here there is correlation with various other things, such as the release of the sequel, as well as certain events like the 9/11 attacks and 7/7 bombings that may very well have influenced some bands looking at Sparta and this clash of civilizations between East and West, represented by the film, including a band called Sons of Liberty from Nashville, Indiana. And the thing about Sons of Liberty is that this is a side project of John Schaefer, who is better known as the guitarist and lead songwriter of the very popular American heavy metal band Iced Earth. And John Schaefer took part in the 2021 January 6th Capitol insurrection. He was arrested and he pled guilty, and he's facing several years in prison. Sons of Liberty is a band that largely sings about right-wing conspiracy theories, and its 2011 album, Sign of the Times, has a song called Molen Labe, which is a very common rallying cry of libertarians. And we can see in this representation of the Battle of Thermopylae in the song Molen Labe direct quotations of the film 300. Okay, onward we march to the mouth of hell. Tell your king these men are free. Eyes as black as night, describing the immortals. The wall of Persian dead. Okay, these are elements from the film that were either directly quoted from the dialogue or were elements that were manufactured by the film, such as the wall of Persian dead is not a part of the battle as described by Herodotus and other ancient sources. Okay? So to sum up, we see some of the implications and the reasons for heavy metal's reception of Antiquity as influenced by Hollywood. Okay? And kind of the three main takeaways here for why this matters is that, first off, heavy metal music lyrics and imagery have been and will continue to be heavily inspired by cinema, as it has since the very beginning. Next, metal artists incorporate the versions of Antiquity presented by popular films into their art, either out of ignorance or deliberately, because these depictions are familiar cultural touchstones that also resonate with the heavy metal ethos. Finally, metal lyrics, cover art, and music videos, and thus the film-inspired versions of Antiquity therein, are consumed by millions worldwide. Okay? In other words, the way that Hollywood portrays the ancient world has an impact beyond just what people see on the screen. But this also influences musicians of one of the most popular genres of music in the world today. And the consumers of that music are also consuming those representations of Antiquity for better or worse. Thank you.